12. The Nightbeat starts right now.
Two San Antonio area priests removed over accusations of sexual misconduct. Tonight, how the Archdiocese says those allegations first came to light.
And we're all being told to conserve water, but there's an area where water has been spewing reportedly for months. Tonight, what neighbors are saying about the leak and how San Antonio water system is responding.
Now, we're going to continue with our local newscast as long as we can, but we do know that ABC News is going with a special report right now on new indictments against former President Donald Trump.
Yeah, let's go to that.
This indictment handed up by Fulton County has charged Donald Trump and 18 other individuals for their alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election results in the state of Georgia. Again, you're aware of the other criminal indictments we've been reporting on. Two of them are at the federal level. The special counsel, of course, is Jack Smith. This is a very different case. Again, this involves Donald Trump and 18 other individuals at the state level for allegedly trying to overturn the results in that election that Joe Biden had won in the state of Georgia. Now, in this case, it's not a special counsel. It's the DA, Fani Willis, who presented her case to the grand jury all day today, more quickly than expected, calling in witnesses earlier than expected as well. Trump today firing off a string of attacks on social media against that DA. Trump also taking aim at Georgia's former lieutenant governor, a conservative Republican in that state, Jeff Duncan, who was just one of the witnesses. Trump saying Duncan should not testify before the grand jury, went ahead and testified anyway. As I pointed out a moment ago, for Donald Trump, this is now his fourth criminal indictment, including two federal cases brought by the special counsel Jack Smith. And here in New York, the 34-count indictment brought by the Manhattan DA for allegedly falsifying business records. Today's indictment comes after a 2.5-year investigation. Let's dive right into the names here. I've got the team here: Pierre Thomas, John Carl, Rachel Scott, all with me here at the desk. Donald Trump listed first in this indictment that I'm looking at, just crossing now. Right underneath are some of the names that you'll be very familiar with at home. Rudy Giuliani facing a number of counts. John Charles Eastman, Mark Randall Meadows. Mark Meadows, of course, the former chief of staff, and of course, in that role during that key time period leading up to the election, straight after the election, up to, of course, January 6th, the certification of that election in Washington. Kenneth Chesbrough, Jeffrey Bossert Clark, Jenna Ellis, Ray Stallings Smith, Robert David Cheeley, Michael Roman, David James Schaefer, Sean Micah Thresher Still, I should say, Stephen Cliffgard Lee, Harrison William Prescott Floyd, Trevian Cootie, Sidney Catherine Powell. Of course, Sidney Powell, one of the attorneys who came before the cameras and the American people with her theories on why the election was not Joe Biden's, that had been a victory for him, though all of her theories had been shot down, not just by the other campaign or the other side, but by courtrooms across this country. Kathleen Alston Latham, Scott Graham Hall, Misty Hampton, also known as Emily Misty Hayes, they say in this indictment. Now, a lot of these names are household names, but John Carl, some of these names are not known, and I would guess some of them are these so-called fake electors.
There are at least two fake electors that I see immediately off this. David Schaefer, who was also the head of the Republican Party in Georgia. Also Sean Still. But what's significant here, David, we're at our fourth Trump indictment. But this is the first one that takes Trump and the people that were with him trying to overturn the election. And these are the biggest names. These are the people that were helping him lead the effort. Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, John Eastman, who wrote the whole strategy of trying to get Mike Pence to overturn the election, but was also very involved in the effort to get fake electors from the states Trump was contesting. Kenneth Chesbrough was the lawyer who came up with that strategy specifically of saying we can go as long as we get our electors voted on in the state house. They did it secretly in the state house in some cases, including in Georgia, but they did this in 7 different states. So this is a broad, sweeping indictment. In some ways, even though it deals with just one state, more sweeping than the election interference case that we saw Jack Smith take on. And one other point about Georgia, David, Trump was really contesting 6 7 states, if you include New Mexico, that he lost to Joe Biden. But Georgia was the state that was closest of all of them. And it was a state in the deep South. It was the defeat that hurt Trump the most. More than any of these states, it was the state that he was obsessed with getting his defeat overturned.
And again, this is a speaking indictment, if you will. We've talked a lot about this on the air. I know, Pierre, you're ready to jump in. I just want to read for viewers at home what it says on page 14, which is essentially the first key page after the counts are listed in this indictment. It says defendant Donald John Trump lost the United States presidential election held on November 3rd, 2020. One of the states he lost was Georgia. Trump and the other defendants charged in this indictment refused to accept that Trump lost, and they knowingly and willfully joined a conspiracy to unlawfully change the outcome of the election in favor of Trump. That conspiracy contained a common plan and purpose. That's key there. It contained a common plan and purpose shared by these people. That's the allegation here from Fani Willis, to commit 2 or more acts of racketeering activity in Fulton County, Georgia, elsewhere in the state of Georgia, and in other states, Pierre.
David, extraordinary. You have a local prosecutor using racketeering laws, which are typically used to fight against mobsters and drug lords. And she's basically saying that these people engaged in a plan, knowing that they lost, to basically circumvent the will of the people. And there are specific acts that are being laid out in this indictment. Number one, that this call to the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, in which Trump is asking for 11,780 votes, that was an attempt to basically corrupt an official in the state government. Also, the notion that they were using the fake electors was fraud. So she's saying that there were a group of people led by Donald Trump, he's at the center of it, who engaged in a conspiracy, again, to subvert the will of the people. It's just a stunning case here. We've seen this so many different times before, David, but each case, this is a case study of a local prosecutor saying local laws were broken in the commission of this conspiracy.
She's well known in that community, the first woman to hold this role. She essentially beat her boss to become district attorney in Fulton County. She's known one of the cases she took on was against the school system in that area for cheating. And she prosecuted it in some ways that are quite similar to this, alleging a conspiracy. I want to read from page 15 here. This criminal organization constituted an enterprise, a term that is defined, and she talks about the legal statute that defines this. A group of individuals associated. The defendants and other members and associates of the enterprise had connections and relationships with one another and with the enterprise. And goes on to write, the enterprise constituted an ongoing organization whose members and associates functioned as a continuing unit for a common purpose. Let's get right to Erin Katursky, our senior investigative reporter outside the courthouse. And Erin, again, the fact that she's using the state statute here, we know there's one at the federal level as well, but she's turned to the state law that they essentially use to prosecute, mob bosses and criminal organizations.
And in the state of Georgia, the racketeering statute is often used to do other things, to bring these kinds of sweeping cases. It gives prosecutors a little more leeway, David, to bring in evidence, not just from Fulton County, but perhaps from elsewhere in the state. And I took note that one of the people charged here, Misty Hamilton, is the former election supervisor in Coffee County, where there was a supposed breach of election machines. That clearly has constituted some of this criminal conspiracy that's being alleged now. But to see right plainly on page 15, as you point out, that former President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Ken Chesborough, and others constituted a criminal organization, the prosecutor said, whose members and associates engaged in various related criminal activities. And she goes on to list them: false statements and writings, impersonating a public officer, forgery, filing false documents, influencing witnesses, computer theft, computer trespass. This does read like a criminal organization doing something perhaps for profit. But here, the prosecutor, Fani Willis, who we're going to hear from shortly, says the motive was to keep Trump in power unlawfully. David, this indictment was handed up some 12 hours after prosecutors began presenting their case to a grand jury after dark. after hours. The judge kept his courtroom open, told everybody to hang in there because he was doing the same. They moved very fast, calling witnesses today, calling in some who were supposed to testify later in the week so that they could be on notice and ready. They clearly wanted to get this done, David.
Aaron Gatursky just outside the courthouse. Aaron, thank you. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, also reading through this with us. And Dan, the sweeping nature of this indictment, what do you make of it?
So they're talking about 161 acts that were committed as part of this criminal enterprise. And what she does is she takes it through chronologically, starting from actually before the election. In act number 1, she makes a reference to the fact that on October 31st, he's already talking about making a speech declaring victory, even if he doesn't win. And so she's saying, in effect, that's where it starts. It starts even before Election Day. And then she takes it through chronologically. With each act in these 161 acts, not all of them are specifically related to Donald Trump. Each of them relate to, some of them to Donald Trump, some to others, but ending in false statements that were made to the grand jury even in late 2022. So that is the totality of the criminal enterprise that she's talking about here. But that's just the first count of what appears to be 41 counts in this indictment. Again, some relating to Donald Trump, some relating to others. But when I look at this, I think of a couple of things. First of all, the fact that so many lawyers are indicted here. I mean, these are attorneys who are being charged with a crime for their role in this effort. And I think that when you look at what are the most significant parts of the indictment, I think it goes to not things that just people said, not things that just people advocated, but documents, false documents, falsely claiming these electors saying, we are the duly elected officials, the representatives of the state, when they weren't. And that's why it's so important that they have cooperators here. Because if they do have some of those fake electors who are going to say, presumably, what they knew about exactly what the evidence was, what they were thinking as this was happening. And the second one I think that's really important is with regard to tampering with voting machines. I mean, you're talking about after January 6th, allegations that they're going and accessing voting machines without permission. Those are the kinds of allegations that are tougher to defend against than, well, I thought we'd won. Well, I was just trying to advocate for my case, etc.
Dan Abrams watching this along with the rest of us as we await Fani Willis, the DA there in Fulton County, about 12 minutes past 11 o'clock here on the East Coast. She's expected to speak about 8 minutes from now, shed more light on the indictment, the sweeping indictment just handed up by the grand jury in Fulton County, Georgia. A couple of things that stand out right away. One of which was something we believed might be part of this indictment, and in fact it is, John Carl, this alleged intimidation that we've reported on heavily of those 2 election workers in Georgia.
Yes, this was a major part of the drama in Georgia, the pressure that election workers, including Shay Moss and her mother, Ruby Freeman, who were 2 workers that were involved in the vote counting, and they came under enormous pressure. They were targeted directly by Donald Trump himself. Donald Trump mentioned Ruby Freeman's name more than a dozen times during that infamous call with Brad Raffensperger, but 3 names that are directly involved with the effort to intimidate and pressure these 2 include Stephen Cliffgard Lee. He was a pastor who approached Ruby Freeman at her home and basically made what was allegedly threatening messages. You need to come out and admit the election fraud was here. Do it for the safety of your family, essentially, was the message. Also, a fellow by the name of Trevian Cootie, who was somebody who had worked with Kanye West, who also approached them with the same message. You need to come out and to acknowledge that this fraud that didn't exist, had happened. And the person that set that up, also a fellow by the name of Harrison Floyd. But these were 3 individuals allegedly directly involved with an effort to intimidate these 2 election workers who would later go on to testify before the January 6th committee.
We wondered what kind of role Mark Meadows would play in any kind of indictment. Again, the former chief of staff to Donald Trump during that key period, the end of Donald Trump's term as president and leading into all these questions, and of course up to the certification. I want to bring in John Santucci because John, our editorial producer who has covered Donald Trump for years, on page 45 of this indictment, it talks about late December. So this is after the election, obviously, about a week or more before the January 6th certification. And it talks about Mark Meadows sending a text message to the office of the Georgia Secretary of State, Chief Investigator Francis Watson, that stated in part, and this quotes the text message from Mark Meadows to the Secretary of State investigator: is there a way to speed up Fulton County signature verification in order to have results before January 6th if the Trump campaign assisted financially? And Fani Willis goes on to write here, this was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. John, what do you make of that?
Yeah, David, I mean, this really speaks volumes, because the question had always been, you know, Donald Trump's team was bifurcated, if you will. There was the team led by Rudy Giuliani outside of the White House that we saw making the trips down to Fulton County, Georgia, out to Pennsylvania, out to Nevada. But there was always that question, David, of what was going on in the White House. What was happening among the individuals that were still closest to the president in the final days leading up to January 6th. And right there, to see in that document, David, that Mark Meadows was on the phones, working it, texting people, offering up from his position as chief of staff financial support from the Trump campaign to do something, if you will, about that election results down in Georgia. It's just striking, David, and it goes to show the way that this indictment has been laid out. I mean, we've been saying this term, speaking indictment, over and over again as we've been going through these different cases for the last several months. But just to see the piecemeal is coming together here, the texts, the tweets, everything that this DA has pulled together from their fact-finding mission, if you will, over the last several months is just incredible. And I think, David, you brought this point up in our past coverage. There has been questions around Trump world of, frankly, who still is in Trump world, who is communicating with Donald Trump. David, I can tell you from talking to multiple sources in just the last few days, it is their understanding that Donald Trump and Mark Meadows have not spoken for several months. And to think, David, that relationship, which was so close, those two guys were considered inseparable at some point. The fact that they're not speaking and now they are both in this indictment, David, you do have to wonder where this does go forward.
But, John, you did learn in recent days that Donald Trump, his legal team at Bedminster, did meet with others who they thought might be pulled into this. Very concerned about what might be coming from this Fulton County DA. Yeah, David, in just the last couple of days, my sources tell me that Donald Trump actually brought his legal team down in Fulton County, Georgia, up to Bedminster, New Jersey. It was in that meeting, David, that the former president asked his legal team, what is this case going to be? What is this going to look like? And I'm told the two attorneys in that meeting, David, Drew Feinling and Jennifer Little, who have actually been, if you will, some of the longest serving attorneys to Donald Trump in relation to all of these four investigations, they told the former president they believed other individuals in addition to him would be indicted. And I'm told, David, that as they went through the possibilities of names, one of the names that Donald Trump focused on quite intently was Rudy Giuliani. And it wasn't so much the idea that, Rudy would flip on me or go against me, but there's actually a personal relationship here, David. Donald Trump doesn't have many personal friends. He has looked at the former New York City mayor and his one-time personal attorney as just that, a close friend of well over 3 decades. Concerned about Rudy, David, but also concerned, David, about who these other people could be. And I would just make one other note, David, that, when we talked about the last indictment we went through, the January 6th indictment, we talked a lot about the unindicted co-conspirators in that case. They weren't named. They weren't identified because they were not indicted. We see in this document from DA Fani Willis that there are at least 30
unindicted co-conspirators. And as we learned just a few hours after Team Trump read through the January 6th indictment, you have got to imagine right now, David, they are doing the same thing. They are pouring through this document, trying to figure out who is who, and then, David, looking in the mirror and saying, do we still have a relationship with any of these people? Could we have a problem here?
Well, it's an extraordinary indictment and sweeping in nature. We are, again, waiting for Fani Willis to come before the cameras. You can see the microphone set up there. This is not only a major local story in the state of Georgia there, but across this country, watching what Georgia would do. Obviously, looking at these two sort of parallel timelines, the special counsel at the federal level and then Fani Willis moving full steam ahead in Georgia in much more of a sweeping nature. Asha Rangappa with Yale Law School, former special agent with the FBI, as we await Fani Willis. Something you had said to us before we came on the air tonight, if Fani Willis moved forward using, RICO basically in the state of Georgia, we know federal level and state level, but if she cited this law, this code in this indictment, she was essentially saying, they weren't stealing cars or whatever else you might want to accuse them of, but that they were allegedly trying to steal the election?
Yes, she's likening Trump to a mob boss or a gang leader. Fani Willis has actually used this statute to prosecute a leader of a gang before. And what she's saying is that this is a person who is directing a pattern of criminal activity. What RICO allows is for prosecutors to get to the person at the top, the person who may not be involved in every single criminal act. And it allows her to link together a number of sub-conspiracies. So the conspiracy to get the Secretary of State to find those votes, the other conspiracy to submit this false slate of electors. What RICO says is that this is all interrelated criminal activity. It's part of a bigger criminal enterprise. She lists 161 criminal racketeering acts in this indictment. Each defendant only has to have participated in 2 of them to be liable for the whole thing, including Donald Trump. And I think here it's sweeping. It allows her to bring in a lot of activity. It is a contrast with special counsel Jack Smith, who has opted for a very streamlined indictment, very simple, straightforward counts, and only 1 defendant. So it has its pros and its cons, and we'll see how she fares with it.
Let me ask a follow-up to those pros and cons, because you mentioned Jack Smith sort of streamlining, mentioning co-conspirators, but not by name, indicting Donald Trump only. She has done a much more sweeping indictment here, not only speaking of co-conspirators, but naming them and charging them. Is that a more challenging case to prosecute, Asha?
I think where the challenge could come is in both not just convincing a jury, but also making the case in the court of public opinion, which when you're prosecuting a former president, I think is really important. So in the former prosecutors that I've talked to, both federal and state, there's been some debate on the keep it simple, stupid approach, where you want everyone to understand exactly what you're doing, or whether you do something so complex that people don't fully get exactly what's going on. I do think here, in looking at the acts that she's presented, she can still tell a pretty straightforward, compelling story. I mean, he was trying to find fake votes. They were trying to present a fake slate of electors. They were harassing election officials. But it is very different than just indicting one person for events that we saw unfold on television, which is what Jack Smith is doing. This is a lot of the stuff that was happening behind the scenes. I think it will be very important that these proceedings are televised, because I think that will allow her to make the case to the American public in a way that Jack Smith might not be able to, since his proceedings won't be broadcast.
And Asha, for those of us who aren't lawyers, and that includes me right here, I mean, we're going to see this because there are cameras in court in Georgia. That's going to be a key difference here. But also, do we see them brought in as a group? If she's alleging this conspiracy, she's named all of them and indicted them on many of the same charges. I mean, you look at Donald Trump, counts 1, 5, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, 27 through 29, 38 through 39. And just beneath him, Rudy Giuliani, counts 1 through 3, 6 through 7, 9, 11, 13, and so on and so on. I mean, will you see these alleged co-conspirators brought into that courtroom during this trial together?
Well, I think one of the things that Jack Smith was considering in his calculations is that the more defendants you have, the more potential for delay, because you may have defendants who have interests that are adverse to each other. You may have people who flip, and you may have other legal issues that come up. So I'm not sure that you'll see all these people in the courtroom together. I think it might actually be some time before they are in a courtroom. And so that's one of the trade-offs that she's made. On the other hand, this does seem to be a good division of labor between the federal and state governments. We tend to think of presidential elections as being a federal interest, but they're administered by the states. The harm when you interfere in an election accretes to the states that are administering them. And that's what Fani Willis is trying to vindicate here. And in some ways, maybe the extra delay and extra complexity is going to be worth it. I'll add here, David, it's important to note that Trump and his co-defendants won't have the option for a pardon here, a federal pardon, even if he becomes president, because it's a state crime. And in Georgia, the pardon power doesn't actually rest with the governor. It rests with the Board of Parole and Pardons, and can only be given after 5 years of a sentence is completed. So that option is not there for the people who might have been banking on it.
Yeah, a lot of people have been asking that question in this country who've been following these cases. And as Asha rightly points out here moments ago, making the point that any sort of pardon or commuting of the sentence in this case would be very different than the Jack Smith case at the federal level. In Georgia, because it's at the state level, President Trump, if he were reelected, could not pardon himself, could not be pardoned by the governor of Georgia. It would be by the parole board, and only after 5 years of serving any potential conviction and sentence that would go along with it. As we await Fani Willis here, the DA, and forgive me if I have to cut you off, Chris, midway, but let's bring in Chris Timmons, former Georgia prosecutor. He's an expert on the RICO Act right there in Georgia, veteran prosecutor in Georgia. You were looking at this, and I know at first glance, even you said this is massive.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really big indictment. There are 161 acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. One of the things that's important is that not all of them are crimes. For example, if you look at Act number 58, it talks about sending an email. There are other Act number 57. It's against David Schaefer, who's a politician here, reserved room 216 at the Georgia State Capitol of Fulton County government. That's not a crime in and of itself. It's just an act in furtherance of the conspiracy. So anytime someone performs an act in furtherance of a conspiracy, they join the conspiracy. Probably the best example I can give you of that is, let's take an armed robbery, for example. If you've got 4 people involved in the armed robbery, one person goes off to rent a car, that's not a crime. Another person goes off to buy a gun, again, not a crime. But the folks that have purchased the gun and rented the car, if they then move toward an armed robbery, those are all acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. But it's a sweeping indictment.
And that will be the challenge she faces in drawing it all together and trying to make the case that they each played a role in this. John Carl, just from reporting on Donald Trump for many years, you and I have talked about this before, he doesn't use email. He very rarely, texts people, if you will. But in this indictment, and it is sweeping in nature, so we're still reading through it, they draw direct connections to multiple phone calls to people in very high-ranking positions in the state of Georgia.
It goes day by day by day, and I mean just to pick a couple of these. That he's calling the president pro tem of the Georgia Senate. He's calling the governor of Georgia.
Donald Trump
himself. There's a lot of calls from Giuliani and the others. Trump himself calling the president pro tem of the Senate, calling Brian Kemp, the governor, calling the attorney general, Chris Carr, the Georgia attorney general, Chris Carr, calling the speaker of the House in Georgia. And in Fani Willis's telling here, trying to get them to violate their oaths of office by taking part in this scheme to overturn the election. And keep in mind, all of these calls are happening. The first one that I can see here from the presidents to Brian Kemp on December 5th is after Georgia has gone through not 1, not 2, but 3 separate counts of the ballots. There was the election day count, there was a machine recount, and then they actually counted all of the millions of votes that were cast in Georgia by hand. It took weeks. And even after all of that, he's beginning this effort to overturn the election.
And of course, the key moment, that phone call with Raffensperger that gets a lot of attention.
One of many calls, because we have a tape of it. But you can imagine what was going on all of these other calls, where he's soliciting, allegedly, according to this indictment, soliciting these public officials, high-ranking officials in Georgia, to violate their oath of office and to make false claims about voter fraud
So as we wait
Georgia.
Fani Willis here, John, let's just listen to part of that phone call with the Secretary of State Raffensperger. Again, just one example of all the phone calls that John points out rightly in this indictment that Fani Willis is making the case Donald Trump was involved with himself directly, multiple phone calls, but here's just one of them.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
So that was the alleged pressure campaign behind the scenes. Obviously, we have reported on that piece of audio before. That was an extensive phone call, by the way, that Fani Willis will point to likely often in this case. I want to bring in Steve Osunsami, who is based in Georgia, covers the nation, but of course, the presidential race, 2020 and 2024 now. Steve, hard to believe it's already here. But in addition, in this indictment, Fani Willis is going to aim to try to hold not only Donald Trump, but these alleged co-conspirators, but primarily Donald Trump, responsible for the false statements made after the election.
That's right, David. And I have to tell you, as a longtime resident here and someone who was here on the ground during the election of 2020, during all of that, you know, I get a little PTSD reading this document and hearing that phone call. I want to point you, though, to page 51, where she breaks down all the different lies that he told to Raffensperger and other state officials, lies against the Fulton County workers, lies about dead voters, all these different lies. For the first time, he is really being held accountable here in this document, in these charges, and so are all these other people who were speaking to House committees, who were talking to state lawmakers, who were using the lies to further their effort. And all of that is being detailed here. I will say that for many residents here, these allegations that are being underlined in this document are right on time. There is definitely a feeling in Fulton County that she is doing good work, and that this is something that she should be doing, and that they're hoping that she gets the job done. David.
Steve Osunsami, just outside the courthouse, lives in Georgia, has lived this as someone who is part of that community, but also as a reporter who covered the presidential race leading up to 2020 for us extensively as we await Fani Willis, and we think this could come at any time. Our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pierre Thomas, you heard Steve talk about it, trying to hold Donald Trump accountable and this team of alleged co-conspirators for falsehoods meant to not only fool voters in this country, but to put pressure on local and state officials to listen up here. You know, we got to work at trying to overturn this election, allegedly. That's what she's saying in this indictment was what they were trying to do.
David, absolutely. And one of the things that we'll see if Ms. Willis can prove her case in court. That remains to be seen. But there's been an issue of, does this involve free speech? Was this, politics gone wrong? Was it dirty politics? And what she does in the indictment is she goes to great pains to say that lying in and of itself is not the issue. But look at page 16 of the indictment. It says that, quote, the enterprise made false statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election. The purpose of these false statements was to persuade Georgia legislators to reject lawful electoral votes cast by the duly elected and qualified presidential electors from Georgia. So, in other words, the lies had an intention, and the intention were to get the state officials to do the bidding of Donald Trump, not the will of the people. And the other thing that she does is
essentially convince them that there was wrongdoing, that these aren't the facts as you understand them, and to get them to act on it.
To get them to act on it.
That's the allegation.
That's the allegation. And then the other thing that she does is she points out that in terms of the fake electors, that these documents regarding the fake electors were actually submitted to official members of the government. Quote, the President of the United States Senate, the documents regarding fake electors were given to, the Archivist of the United States of America, the Georgia Secretary of State, and the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. So in other words, it wasn't just that they were talking about the fake electors being involved in the electoral process. They actually submitted paperwork to officials who were considering the election. Those are overt acts, she said, that go beyond free speech, that go beyond just lying, that go beyond politics. They go to, again, trying to influence the people who were making the decision about the election. That's the things that she's taking great pains to do in this indictment.
Making the case that this was a plan, and the team was in on the plan.
You know, one important point of that is who was he trying to pressure? Who were they trying to pressure? It was all Republicans. The people I listed of those phone calls, Brian Kemp, who he wanted to hold a special session of the legislature to overturn the certified election results.